Hey there, guys. Welcome to what I'm going to be calling a bi-weekly series. In all honesty, though, I'm a little bit overcommitted, so no promises on it actually coming out every 2 weeks. This series, I'm going to be discussing a lot of things that are interesting to me, from YouTube to streaming, gaming, game design, game theory, all sorts of stuff. Really, whatever interests me and I want to share with you all. This initial episode, though, is primarily coming from the game I've been streaming most recently, Valkyria Chronicles 2. Valkyria Chronicles 2 is a bit of a problematic game. It's good, and I'm glad I'm playing it, but it has some severe issues. And one of the biggest ones is its main character, Yvonne Hardings. Before I get into him, though, let me just talk about main characters in general terms, and why they're made the way they are, and the way we can make them in order to avoid the problems that we run into in Valkyria Chronicles 2. To start with, whenever a company makes a protagonist, there's a couple of things that protagonist has to do, in addition to any other character they would have to put in. Most characters really just need to be relatable. They need to have an interesting story arc, and they have to have enough of a personality that they won't be annoying as you keep running into them over the course of the game. The main character, though, it has to do all of those things, but it also has to serve as the player's portal to the world. The main character will be the one primarily relating to all the other characters in the piece, and so it needs to have a much broader range of reaction than supporting characters. If you want a great example of what I'm talking about, just look at Pirates of the Caribbean, or Caribbean, or however you want to pronounce it. In in the Caribbean 1, the main characters are very, very clearly William Turner and Elizabeth Swann. Jack Sparrow is a supporting character. He is in there in order to be zany, he's in there to be fun, he's in there to kind of keep everything moving and kind of be a almost plot catalyst, so to speak, but he's not the character that the story revolves around. And that's really important, because he doesn't have that broad a range of reactions. He's built much more narrowly, much more fun. The Elizabeth and William are the more grounded characters that have an actual serious character arc and can actually be affected by the plot. Fast forward to Pirates of the Caribbean 4 on Stranger Tides, they've taken William and Elizabeth out and focused solely on Jack Sparrow. And judging by Metacritic and everyone I've talked to, on Stranger Tides is the worst of the series. Because Jack Sparrow isn't designed to react realistically to things. He's not designed to have a broad personality. So, needless to say, when you force him into the title role, he just can't carry a film as effectively. And it has nothing to do with Johnny Depp, it has to do with the difference between a main character and a supporting character. But let's get back to video games, because video games are awesome. Another aspect of being the main filter from which the character experiences the game is that the main character is also going to have to be told all the things the player needs to know. Whatever game you're designing, there's going to be aspects of it that the player is going to need to be filled in on. Tutorials can do a lot of this work for you, but anything that deals with legends of the land, politics, religion, or just general knowledge stuff is typically going to have to be handled by exposition. The problem that comes up is, why is this exposition present? The main character should be aware of all this stuff already. So you end up having to explain why the main character is so ignorant of the status quo of the world he lives in. So now we get back to Valkyria Chronicles 2. Valkyria Chronicles 2 takes what should be a very obvious step and just says, hey, let's just make the main character be an idiot that didn't pay attention to anything. It seems on paper like it would work great. My player doesn't know anything about the world, let's just make the main character not know anything about the world. But in practice, it really kills a game. The main character, especially in RPGs, is the in-game representation of the player. So, when you're making the player insert character be at least partially defined by an extremely negative character trait. Either he's lazy, he's forgetful, he's stupid. Whenever I'm playing a game like this, I'm playing it as an escape. I'm playing it as a way to get away from the day-to-day rat race. When I go into a game, I want to experience something greater than myself. I want to experience an adventure I can't find in the real world. Nothing kills my sense of adventure like going into a game and finding that the main character, the me of this world, is so much worse at dealing with his life than I am in the real world. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying the main character can't have flaws. A lot of the most gripping and most beautiful games I've played have been built on the protagonist's flaws. But those are flaws that are built up over the course of the game, and they are used in service of the narrative. They're not a crutch in order to excuse information drops. So if we don't want to take the Valkyria Chronicles method of just making a really bad and stupid protagonist, there are some other options. Until about a decade or so, the most prominent option was the silent protagonist. Building the main character as a silent protagonist is to game design what minimalism is to home decor. By building the narrative so the character says very, very little, you create a situation where the viewer is able to fill the void of the character's personality and the character's thoughts with their own thoughts. If an NPC is explaining something really dumb and obvious, the player can simply insert their own irritation at the exchange to the protagonist. And since the protagonist doesn't actually feed the scene in any way, that becomes the reality of how that scene plays out. It's certainly not a perfect scenario, as it still involves a lot of exposition which shouldn't logically be required, but it does remove the protagonist from the position of actually appearing to need the information presented. And by not needing it, it causes the problem to be dispersed across the entire game instead of being a fault of the player insert character. Needless to say, however, this is still not a perfect solution. It's better than making a stupid protagonist, but it's still not perfect. After all, it's way better to not have blame that needs to be dispersed than to be able to disperse the blame out across the entire game experience. And that's where our third and the best type of protagonist comes in. One that I call the displaced protagonist. Displaced protagonist is a protagonist which is simply out of their depth. They're not experienced at the environment within which the game happens. Since we started with Valkyria Chronicles 2, let's go back to Valkyria Chronicles 1 and look at Welkin. Welkin is a great protagonist. He's introduced as a naturalist and as a scholar. From the very first scene in the game, you see that he's very, very well learned and very, very inquisitive. However, in terms of the military, it's shown that he's only really had some experience fighting with a militia. He is really out of his depth when it comes to how the military actually practices. This is really important, because of course, later on in the game, whenever there's things coming up and people are having to tell him how to assemble a squad, having to tell him about military tactics and all of that, it works and it makes sense. Welkin has no real reason to be familiar with that process, so it's very plausible that someone has to explain it to him. Another great example of this is Tales of Zestria's Sorey. Sorey, again, is being shown as someone that's very, very inquisitive, someone who's very, very craves information and is not shy about going and looking for it. However, because of the way the game is set up, Sorey spent the first part of his life completely sequestered from the rest of the world. So that as he goes out and explores the world, he does have to have a lot of things explained to him and a lot of things he's not familiar with because he's never been out of the village he starts the game in. There's a lot of different examples I could give, and there's a lot of ways to achieve the result of the displaced protagonist. But the key is to make the narrative of your game needs match the inexperience of your hero, so that you can make the game explain things to the hero without insulting the hero. There is a fourth option, though. And this is beautiful and very, very rare. I wish I saw it more. This entire video we've been discussing the problems inherent due to the extra narrative load the main character brings to the table. That does, however, presuppose that there needs to be a main character. What if there's not? Let's look at Wild Arms for a second. Wild Arms had an absolutely genius system where each of its three main characters had a little brief introductory chapter of, about 15 minutes or so. At the end of that chapter, it led them to the scene where the game began, or would begin. When the game did begin, all three characters were there and pretty much stayed together for the rest of the playthrough. That setup allows the player to be dispersed amongst the party as a whole, and there's not any one specific character that's meant to represent the player. Some might certainly identify with one character more than another, but the writers have loads more freedom in order to make characters with flaws, since even if you have a dumb character, or a character that's an asshole, or whatever you wanted to do, you no longer have one character that represents the player. So if a player doesn't identify with that, they simply kind of marginalize that character and push them to the side and don't focus on them. Another great example of this is Final Fantasy VI. You could make an argument that the main character of Final Fantasy VI is Terra. You could also make a great argument that the main character is Locke, or Kelez, or Celeste. I don't know how you pronounce her name, but all three of them have very strong arguments as to why they're the main character. But for me, I've always thought that none of the characters are the main characters. If you look at the way that game is put together, you're playing that game for less than an hour and you lose control of Terra. And Locke takes over and you control him for a bit. And then to drill the point home, within like the first fourth of the game, you lose Terra for a long time. She leaves the plot for what feels like a fourth of the entire game. By doing this, the game designers are really, really sending a strong message that this is a game built around multiple characters, not just one. Again, like I talked about with Wild Arms, the player is absolutely free to identify with anyone in the cast, and de-emphasize anyone they don't really like. So, this video set out in order to find the best way to build a character, and at the end of the day, after thinking about this a lot, I think the best way might be just simply refuse to build a main character. Main characters are always going to have problems. There's a lot of great characters out there that simply do not work as main characters. And rather than force yourself into a kind of boring main character, just build your game in such a way that you don't have any character serving as the primary one, and things work a lot better, I think. So, that's it. First episode is done. Woo! Like I said, I'll be throwing these up every 2 weeks or so, covering a whole variety of topics. I'm thinking, YouTube's copyright system is definitely going to have an episode, looking at female characters and how you can have a lure without having exploitation, what factors go into that, and there's a whole bunch of other topics bouncing around my head right now. But if there's anything you want me to hear my thoughts on, if there's anything you want to examine more closely, by all means, leave them in the comments below. That's what comments are for, after all. And you don't want to make comments section feel bad, do you? You monster.